Hello, this is Heartstock Radio, and I am your host, Carol Murphy. Today, our guest is Dr. Luke Haverhals. In just a moment, he's going to be with us, and we're going to find out all about what he is up to. I'd also like to remind everybody that you can find us on Facebook. You can also email us at heartstockradio@gmail.com. And in just a moment, Dr. Haverhals will be with us. This is Heartstock. Thanks so much for listening.
As I went walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that in the skyway I saw below me.
This is Heartstock Radio. I'm your host, Carol Murphy, and Clark Grant is in the studio. Today, our guest on Heartstock is Dr. Luke Haverhals, and he is the founder and CEO of Natural Fiber Welding Incorporated. Hello, Dr. Haverhals. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Carol, for having me on the show.
Oh, thank you for being our guest. Now, would you prefer that I call you Doctor or Luke?
You just call me Luke. That works absolutely fine.
Fantastic. So let's begin at the beginning. And maybe if you could just give our listeners a brief intro as to what Natural Fiber Welding Incorporated is.
Sure. So Natural Fiber Welding is working on this problem that humanity has, which is that we're over-dependent on plastic. And that over-dependency on plastic means we pollute from an emissions perspective, from an extracting petroleum perspective. It also means that we pollute when our garments and plastic things end up in the environment, usually unintentionally. And instead, what natural fiber welding is doing is pioneering new materials that are made from plants that are low carbon footprint, that are part of the circle of life, and that only use nutrients. So we think replacing petrochemicals with nutrients is the way to go.
And we've talked about this briefly a little bit before on the show, but I'm hoping that we can discuss this a little bit further before we kind of move on here. The whole concept that everybody's used to the idea that, hey, you shouldn't be using plastic bottles if you're purchasing water, maybe 5 bottles a day. Why not substitute that for a reusable water bottle? But a lot of us really are not even aware of the fact that our clothing is also a contributor to this mass problem that we seem to be having of plastics pollution. How is it that our clothing is part of the plastic problem?
Yeah, so in a typical year, COVID makes 2020 a little bit different, but in a normal year, at this point in history, humans use about 100 billion pounds of polyester every year for just textiles, for clothes. So about something like 2/3 of the tonnage of all the textiles in the world is polyester. And so, and there's, a variety of reasons for that, but one of the outcomes is that when you wash your clothes, or even when you wear your clothes, there's microfiber shedding into your house, into the water, etc. So yeah, it's a complicated and big problem.
So let's talk about you for a moment, Luke. And how is it that you ended up on this journey working on this huge problem that society is really desperately needing to solve at this point?
Yeah, so, I could say that my journey starts, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and so I was exposed to life processes and what goes on a small family farm very early, and very curious about how the world works and where things come from, where they go to. And then I grew up a little bit and ended up, I don't know how much into the story we should go, but I could tell you a quick aside, which is I had to make a decision at one point in my life about, should I try to pursue a pro baseball career, or should I become invest in my mind a little bit further and go to grad school. And fortunately, my father helped me make the right decision, which was to invest in my brain and doing some things in chemistry, which was an interest of mine. And so after I got my PhD in chemistry, I went to the U.S. Naval Academy to be a professor of chemistry, and was very fortunate to be part of a group and a research project that was looking into what can you do to use natural materials. And it's well accepted and understood that natural materials are the highest performing, the most circular, the lowest carbon footprint when they're grown regeneratively. What if you could take all those materials and learn how to mold and shape them in ways that are akin to what we do with plastics? If you could do that, you could have higher performing materials, lower impact, better sustainability, circularity, et cetera, all at the same time. And so I was fortunate to do that in the Naval Academy for a number of years. And then my wife and I had 3 beautiful little daughters, and we wanted to move back to the Midwest to be closer to where the families are. And so I landed in Peoria, and I took this idea with me and at Bradley University, started, continuing my academic career. But I had this sort of gnawing thought in the back of my head that this discovery I'd made at the Naval Academy really needed to be commercialized. So in 2015, I did what a lot of people do, which is very naively started a company, not realizing how much work and what a long journey would be, but started a company to commercialize the technology. So here we are in 2020 talking about it.
So I feel like we really need to kind of round this out with a little discussion about why. Why should we all be concerned, and why is there all of this uproar from an environmental standpoint about plastics? Just what exactly is this doing in the way of harm, or is it, kind of inert once it breaks down and gets into the environment?
Yeah, so the first thing to consider with plastics is sort of where they come from. So there are now life cycle analyses that are in the world that say that by 2050, 1/6, actually a little bit more than 1/6 of the global carbon footprint for humanity will be production of plastics. So most people, when plastics were first invented, no one had YouTube and a lot of different teachings out there, a lot of data that let people think about what happens when you scale that kind of a technology to billions of people on planet Earth. So the first consideration is the extractive nature of where plastics come from, and also the amount of energy and the kind of processes, catalysts, and all kinds of things that have to be used and produced in order to make plastics. And then we can talk about the outbound, where plastics go to. So plastics have often been talked about as being very recyclable. The problem is when you really dig into what makes the most sense to recycle plastic, you find that an awful lot of products in the world, like footwear is a good example, are mixtures of plastics, and those mixtures aren't easily separable. So there's not actually very much plastics. Milk jugs and simple things that are one material can get recycled, albeit with a fairly high carbon footprint. But there's many, many materials in our lives that, especially textiles and things like that are complex, and so they're very difficult to recycle, and especially with unit economics that outcompetes the virgin. And then the other piece is that if plastics end up in the environment, they're not nutrients, they're not composed of nutrients. So nature doesn't really know how to break those things down, or if it does, they break down into things that are not always so good. There's more what we could talk about from a chemistry perspective, how there's plasticizers that act like endocrine disruptors. There's the nature of how plastic breaks down when it's exposed to UV light into smaller and smaller particles, and how those particles can infiltrate into cells and do all sorts of things in both aquatic and on terrestrial sort of environments to life. And so those are, people at this point in history, even in 2020, don't have the full data set. There are studies that show that crabs that are exposed to microfiber, for example, don't choose their shells correctly or as efficiently as they should, or as they do when they're in a pristine environment. And so we don't have all the data, but there's a lot of growing concerns just about how plastics affects both the base of the food chain and then also how it might affect people when, we're living in homes and things where we're breathing in these fibers and they can potentially, have unintended consequences in terms of your long-term health outcomes.
Yeah, and I know that I was just listening on NPR recently, and they did a really great piece on investigating the whole likelihood and probability of recycling ever working. And what can you share with us about why can we not just recycle ourselves out of the plastic problem?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Number one is economics. So when it's more expensive to recycle than it is to produce produce a virgin material, then you've got a problem, because what's the incentive for a company to lose money doing recycling, right? And then when you look at why the recycling is more expensive, you realize that plastics, again, there are many materials, textiles being like a case in point, many materials are mixtures. And when you mix different kinds of plastics together or different materials together, like if you take a shoe, for example, a shoe, the kinds of materials that go into the sole and the midsole and the upper and the laces and the eyelets for the laces, they're often many different materials. And so you can't easily separate that into a set of waste streams that can be recycled. It costs a lot of money to do that. And in some cases, the technology is really not there. So while there's a lot of people talking about recycling plastics, there's the reality is there's not that many good technological solutions that work. There are people that are working on things like how do you digest plastics, but the issue there is, again, then all of a sudden you have carbon footprint. When you really get into the technical weeds of how much energy and what you get back from those processes, you find that there's problems, especially, again, when you apply that to then 100 billion pounds of polyester, for example, produced just for textiles. So it's a combination of economics and how technology plays with economics.
Yes, indeed. Now, let's maybe touch upon how you went about deciding what raw materials you're going to use to find replacements, and what products are you trying to replace? Are we talking bottles? Are we talking textiles, leather?
Yeah, eventually everything, but we're starting in the textile world. So when you think about a problem as big as and complex as making plastics from petrochemicals, then kind of at the start, you have to think about if you're going to replace one thing with another, you don't want to replace it with something that isn't more scalable or more economically beneficial, or worse, you don't want to replace something that's not great for the environment with something that's terrible for the environment. And so we can simply note a few things about when you go outside and you look around. Scientists have long noted how diverse nature is and how diverse plants are, that different plants produce different kinds of materials, that production system, if you will, is photosynthesis. So it's sequestration of carbon dioxide powered by sunlight, and it makes all these high performance materials. And it does so at amazing scale, in a way where there's no waste, because anyway, plants, when they are grown, they can biodegrade and be regrown again, of course. And we sort of all take that for granted, that when I, as a chemist, look at the world, I note things like, more new tonnage of plant matter will grow in a day on Earth than the combined tonnage of all the synthetic plastic things that people make in many years. And so plants are way more scalable than petrochemicals and things that come from fossil resources, and they can be grown in regenerative ways that are way less extractive on the environment. And then the materials themselves are higher performing, but plastics can do one trick that is very, very beneficial, and why we have that industry, which is you can very fast, efficient ways mold and shape plastic into various kinds of geometries, and those geometries are useful for everything from filaments for textiles to flexible sheets for leather-like materials. And so when I founded Natural Fiber Welding, it was because of this core idea and discovery that I had at the Naval Academy, which is there actually are ways in which you can mold and shape that abundant natural plant materials that are in the world. And you can do so efficiently, and you can then combine natural materials to be more than what can be grown. So there's a lot of people today who think that we need to grow, new materials, or we should genetically modify organisms to make a new material. And there might be some niche applications for that, but when you stop and think about, the solution has to be big enough to scale to everybody. It has to outscale the petrochemical industry. It needs to do so at unit economics that makes sense. The truth is, there's very few answers out there. The answer is plants. That's what we have. And again, then what I would say is NFW's formation of the problem, that the thing to do is not to try to grow some new exotic kind of plant or grow plants in a different way. Work with those people that regeneratively grow your food, and work with how you take the waste products, the plant matter that's still high performance, but mold it and shape it into those things that become shoes, become car interiors, become your clothing, etc. If you can do that, that's just a fundamentally better system that, makes the world a better place.
We're going to dive more deeply into this with you, Luke. We're going to take a quick midway point break here, and we will be right back. This is Hardstock. Thanks for listening. This is Hardstock Radio. I'm your host, Carol Murphy, and Clark Grant is in the studio. Today, we are speaking with the CEO and founder of Natural Fiber Welding Incorporated, Dr. Luke Haverhals. Hi again, Luke.
Hello.
It's fascinating to me that the solutions have always been here, right? And we decided that we would outsmart ourselves and
exactly
come up with something better, which, as it turns out, not so much. So I would love to hear your journey, how you decided what materials you were going to use. And I would imagine a lot of that had to do with what was abundant and not already being used, and what you were going to make with it specifically, and where you are. I mean, there's so many questions. Can you start with just that issue of, how did you decide what you were going to use? Did you look at other companies that were already in the field?
So when I started doing my research at the Naval Academy with Paul Truelove and a number of folks, we weren't worried about trying to necessarily just solve a problem with how do you recycle T-shirts. We were doing fundamental science that was sort of focused on what can the law of the universe enable us to do? What do the laws allow that we can do that are new and unique and can take advantage of these natural materials that are out there? And so then if I fast forward to starting a company, with a company, you have to decide what's our best shot at getting a product in market. Because investors at the end of the day don't want to just fund science experiments. They want solutions that are going to work in the marketplace. And so it turns out that at least in terms of where we started, we looked at the world and we said, oh, there's 100 billion pounds of 100 billion pounds of polyester produced in the world. There's also 55 billion pounds of cotton that are grown in an average year. And then we can note that the cotton, there's an awful lot of waste cotton that's in the form of old T-shirts and old blue jeans and things like that are in closets. And when you dig in and you discover why people don't recycle cotton today, it has to do with the length of fiber. And it turns out that cotton, when you go to mechanically recycle it, which is by far from a carbon footprint perspective, the absolute best way that you can recycle, old clothing is if you can do it mechanically. And yet the problem is when you try to do that to cotton, the fiber gets shorter. And so this process, this idea that I had at the Naval Academy, we thought about it from the perspective, well, how do we apply that perhaps to all this short cotton that today gets thrown away or doesn't have any useful life to it because the cotton is too short? How do we make that fiber act like it's longer? And it turns out that our technology solves that problem at a fundamental level. And so that's where we started. We started with just the recognition that there's literally tens and hundreds of millions of pounds of waste cotton from previous years that are in our closet. And that's a resource. And then working on a technology solution that makes that short fiber act as if it's the long, staple, a very expensive fiber. And then from there, we generalized the process to think about, like, how do we more generally mold and shape natural materials, beyond waste cotton? And it turns out that when you look into the world, you find that there's an awful lot of leather-like materials. So people have noted the issues with leather, but most people don't recognize that, many people will say that they have an eco-leather, but that eco-leather or that vegan leather is not really leather at all, of course. It's a petroleum-based plastic. And yet the automotive industry is the single largest use case for those kinds of materials. Footwear is number 2. There's all the furniture. There's bags are kind of an afterthought in the leather and the leather-like industry in terms of their overall volumes of use. And yet those materials, they either come from, an awful lot of them come from petrochemicals. And so if we could take things like waste cork powder, if we could take things, that are crop residues and things like that and mold and shape those into flexible materials, then that would be a good solution for leather-like. So that was sort of place number 2 to go. And what natural fiber welding is doing right now is building this whole really an ecosystem of materials that are all based, just like nature is based, the food chain is based in a green plant. We're taking the same approach and we're building this ecosystem of species, if you will, of different materials that are mixtures, complex composites made only from nutrient natural inputs. And that's a really powerful thing because when you base yourself after nature, then that allows you to do what nature does, which is nature upcycles and recycles and downcycles and keeps it all in balance without waste. If we can develop our platform system to do similarly, then okay, we can start with waste cotton. We can extend ourselves into leather-like materials, but we can actually go beyond. There's limitations to what cotton can do. There's limitations to what leather and plastic leathers can do. NFW can make materials no one else can make, no one else can ever grow, because we can combine and make new combinations of things that the universe never thought of before, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And how about your funding? That's always the interesting thing, isn't it, with startups? Do you mind sharing at all with us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, it's publicly discoverable that Ralph Lauren led a Series A investment in natural fiber welding this summer. We'll be talking about a major headline other brand partner that's joining, or I should say not that's joining, that already has joined. We'll talk about that very early next year in the footwear sort of side of things. And what we're doing, I guess, if you say interesting, I'd say you spend, as a startup, especially technical startup, you spend a lot of your time not actually thinking about how to make your technology better or hire smart people to execute scalable ideas, but you spend a lot of your time educating investors on why this technology matters. One of the reasons why we're very pleased to be working with Ralph Lauren, for example, is that their people really just get what the future could be. And, if you think about those brands that use natural materials today that are looking for innovations that give them an edge, you don't have to work near as hard to educate them on what a technology like natural fiber welding can do. So when we talk about Claris performance fabrics, when we talk about Mirum leather-like materials, here I was very fortunate to be able to talk to folks who have materials backgrounds where they're building product every day, and they understand the inherent advantages that our technologies deliver. So, okay, and then there's other things now to do as we're scaling. So now that we've got these strategic partners and we're going to market, now there's the opportunity to continue to grow and bring in extra funding to really take this to the next level of scale.
So who will be your customers? Will it be brands like Ralph Lauren and the likes?
Yeah, that's right. So, there are, and I'm not at liberty to talk about all the different products that we'll be taking to market, and, we'll talk about those on a timeline as we release them. But everything from clothing to bags and accessories to footwear, NFW is actively right now making materials and then working on how we're going to market with a wide variety of partners. And Ralph Lauren is just, one of the first adopters and a major headline adopter of the materials. The other thing that we're doing is there are some products that NFW can make where we can not just make the material, but we can make the entire product. And so there will be opportunities to be even more direct in front of consumers in the future. But we're starting with building our ingredient brands of Claris and Mirum with iconic partners that everybody knows and loves their stuff. We're starting there first.
So Mirum is a leather-like and Claris is a textile-like product? Is that right?
Yeah, that's basically right. Claris, we talked, I mentioned earlier recycling cotton, but the technology applies to things like hemp. So, there's a lot of folks who say, well, it'd be better if we could grow and use industrial hemp instead of cotton, except that, guess what? The problem with the industrial hemp, when you try to cottonize it, is very similar to that recycled cotton problem I talked about earlier, which is the fiber is a little too short in order for that to perform. But NFW, the Claris sort of side of things, solves those problems. So we're going to market with performance textiles that are natural inputs that can wick moisture more quickly and dry and be more abrasion resistant than those naturals have ever been before, and that can make it outcompete the plastics in terms of the overall performance envelope and sustainability. And then what we're working on the Mirum leather side is for those people who have a need for leather-like materials for a variety of applications. It's interesting just to note that the leather that you have maybe on the interior of your car is quite different than the leather that might be your wallet or your bag. And so our technology is really, really tunable. So we can tune for a variety of things that different customers want, or even go beyond. There's some folks that have said they want custom aesthetics or even unique smells and things like that we can put into the materials that let people have a different and a better experience with the product than they've been able to have before. They've always been limited by some of the plastic and other incumbent materials that are in market.
Mm. Well, in about a half a minute that we have left here, if folks want to learn more and or continue the conversation, Luke, how might they reach you?
Yeah, so naturalfiberwelding.com has a website full of information, and then there's also Made with Claris and madewithmiriam.com. If you go to the naturalfiberwelding.com website, there's a contact us part of the web page, and so we have both myself, but a number of other people in the company that handle questions and customer inquiries and things like that, or just general questions people have about the technology where they want to learn and understand. We really view ourselves as not just a solution, that's better for the world, so to speak, but we want to be information. We want to provide people the information they need to make good decisions. So we'd love to talk with folks about that.
Very exciting stuff, and really appreciate you being our guest on Heartstock.
Carol, thank you so much. The pleasure is truly mine. Thank you for what you do.
So we shall see you next week. Thanks for listening. This is Heartstock Radio. Peace.
Heartstock Radio is a production of KBMF 102.5 Butte America Radio. Hear our programs every Friday at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time via livestream at butteamericaradio.org.
As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said, "No trespassing," but on the